Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Jo Moir, and with me today I have my colleague, Marc Daalder. Hi, Marc.
Hey, Jo.
And in Auckland we have the lovely Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Greetings both.
Today we're going to be dissecting the Greens ahead of their big conference in Auckland this weekend, which Marc will be covering for us, and you'll be able to read all about it on newsroom.co.nz. And then we're also going to take a bit of a look at Mr Hipkins, the statesman. Is he? Isn't he? And how he's been going on that international stage. We'll finish up, of course, with some recommendations as always. So first up, Green Party AGM in Auckland this weekend. We're going to have a speech from Marama Davidson and a speech from James Shaw. Basically nothing else is open to the public because it never is. Marc, you're going to be there, but you've also had a chance to have a chat with Marama Davidson about what they're expecting, what things might look like this weekend. Bear in mind, a year ago, James Shaw went into this meeting thinking that everything was A-OK, got completely blindsided, got rolled, suddenly had this period in exile where he wasn't the co-leader anymore. You had a chat to Marama about that, though. So tell us, what's the sort of latest and how the Greens feeling about this weekend?
Yeah, well, Marama said to me that she expects James will still be co-leader after the AGM this year, but she told you, Jo, the exact same thing 48 hours before last year's AGM. I asked her about that, and she said, it was a shock at the time. You can never really say anything for certain because the Greens have this, uniquely democratic way of doing things. But she said that James has sort of got more in touch with the Greens membership, with the party roots over the past year as a result of what happened last year. And so she thinks that they are, much more comfortable with him maybe than they were before. And also everyone's just focused on the election and knows that, any sort of shenanigans like that would be quite damaging to the Greens 3 months out.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because James Shaw seems to make the argument that he lost touch with the membership because he was so focused on being climate change minister, and then getting rolled as co-leader and that vote taking place forced him to go out into some sort of really deep, dark bits of New Zealand that he hadn't been and seen people from his party for quite some time. And he seemed to come back from that sort of quite rejuvenated and having a better understanding of where the party was at. But, I mean, isn't it kind of fair that someone who is the climate change minister at a point in time that we're in be completely focused on that? I mean, the co-leadership stuff, Marama can kind of handle that stuff, can't she?
I think on the one hand, yes, he's got a really big job and he does need to give it his all, and that's what the Green membership is expecting. On the other hand, he is in that position of co-leader. He does have a responsibility to the Green Party, and particularly as you get into the campaign season, that's his big job is less being the climate change minister and more being a party leader. I don't think it's too different from other party leaders. Mr Hipkins has to be the prime minister, but he also has to lead Labour into the election. I think, getting the balance right is tough, but I think what happened last year was probably not fully a reflection of James's engagement or lack thereof with the Greens membership, and more a reflection of, a particular faction of the Greens membership and their long-held views about compromise with Labour, compromise on climate issues, that sort of thing.
Tim, just to bring you in here, I mean, the criticism has always been of James that he's, too close to the centre, and I think a really obvious sort of way of showing that is the fact that he's so well liked across Parliament. I mean, there are very few MPs in any political party who don't have a good working relationship with James. And while that is seen as a positive in terms of his climate change minister role, some of those really sort of left, deep Green Party members see it as a complete and utter negative that James Shaw is liked by so many people, because it suggests that he's not sort of in the thick of those activist sort of, left politics. What do you make? Do you think it's kind of a good thing that he's like that and one of the co-leaders is like that, or do you think it will continue to work against him?
Well, I think it's important that they have people like him. The big thing now, and what I'll be interested, Marc, from your conference, is what can the Greens do to help Labour? What can the Greens do actually to help the Labour-Greens bloc win this thing? They're not doing too badly as a bloc, actually it's quite close. But if they only deal in the extreme positions, or the ones that the people Jo's talking about are advocating only, then that won't really help Labour, will it? So they've got to also find some things that they can do to drag the red-green coalition up, and that's what I'll be fascinated to watch for. We know with the things like obviously on climate, but also on the renters and with the tax policy and things, that they've set out good ground for them as far out as they can. And ACT does the same on the other side, and then they come back a bit, But I think the coming back a bit, we need to see some evidence here of how the Greens might pull the whole thing forward, and not just focus. And I think, to answer your question, Jo, that the James Shaw figure is pretty pivotal in that.
I want to just talk briefly about polling, because we have had another poll, and we're going to take it with a little bit of grain of salt because it is the Roy Morgan poll. It was interesting though because it had Te Pāti Māori up on 7 percentage points. Greens were, remind me, Mark, I think about 9.
9.5, down from 12 at the last Roy Morgan poll.
And you had Labour and National both on 30, and you had ACT on 15, which is fascinating if you've got a situation where you've got National on 30 and ACT on half of that. But I'm just interested, Tim, what did you make of that poll? And I guess what does it mean in terms of, any sort of leverage from Te Pāti Māori, how the Greens react to that, respond to that, etc.?
Well, it's kind of, a bit of a trend to knock the Roy Morgan poll, and it's been wild at times over the years. I think this one, 15, is pretty out there for ACT. ACT's result in 2020 was its highest ever at 7.8 or something like that. And they've had 7.5s and 7.3s in the past. So even if they do really well, they're not going to double at this point unless they really harm National. And that's what probably that bloc won't want, because Labor, when ACT and the Greens have got to their record points in the past, it's been at the great expense of, or at least the great failing of, the main party. I think for the Greens, that Roy Morgan poll is pretty in the zone of where other polls have been. Yes, it might have been coming down from 12 for them, but again, their record ever is 11. That 11 is a high point for them. So if they're at 9 point something, that's doing really well, and it's doing well for their bloc. So I don't think the Greens have to go into this conference weekend at all feeling that the situation is dark for them.
Mark, just lastly on this, what is it that Marama's saying that they're looking to achieve this year? I mean, it's election year, so it's a different conference to any other year. Yes, there's potentially going to be those sort of leadership murmurings. Well, actually, we don't really know, because even if the leaders think it's not happening, sometimes it does, as history has proven. But in terms of issues, what are the Greens looking for? Are they just really looking to solidify that base, or is there kind of reaching more towards that sort of centre left? And if so, what are they seeing as the issues on that front?
Yeah, I think at the AGM they're releasing their manifesto. It's sort of generally a really long document with policies in just about every portfolio area. They've got a few major ones still to roll out on climate, on health, on nature, which will come over the next few months. But, I think the manifesto will probably give us a similar picture of the party as last time, which is more leaning into that left, that radical side of things rather than going for the centre. I think there's a perspective that, Chris Hipkins can mop up the centre, or that's his job in this arrangement, and then they get the left. And they're also really hoping to be able to, turn out first-time voters, people like renters, like Māori, like marginalised people who are less likely to vote but are there and able to vote, and might not be picked up in the polls, but it's a bloc that the Greens think that they can bring to the table.
Next up, we're chatting about Chris Hipkins, the statesman. Is he or isn't he? I am back, fresh, relaxed from China. Not really. Gosh, that was a hell of a week. Big trip for Chris Hipkins. It was, I would argue, kind of the biggest test for him in terms of on the international stage. He'd obviously done a bit of Europe, a bit of Australia, but, this was meetings with some pretty powerful people in China, and one where you really have to be careful what you say, because it doesn't take much to put your foot out of line or fall off the tightrope or whatever you want to call it. That was a reference to Sam Sitchdeva, RIP, we miss him. So let's have a chat about this anyway. In terms of the China trip, Tim, you've been following closely over the weekend, very nicely putting all of my copy into the system for me. Fascinating trip. I think that the meetings that he had at the Great Hall of the People, that meeting with President Xi Jinping, was fascinating. He smashed it out of the park. There was a lot of speculation that it would be a difficult meeting for him, that it might be a bit of a sort of frosty reception. Turns out, very warm, Chris Hipkins couldn't say enough to enough people, enough times that, he just felt so welcome, talked about how comfortable he was, which I think is a bit of a stretch to say you were deeply comfortable sitting across from Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People, but we'll give it to him. What did you make of, I guess, watching it from back home and the sort of performance by Chris Hipkins and sort of what people were making of it?
First of all, I was really fascinated by the handshake that she gave to Hipkins. It seemed to me to be a very kind of restrained and not particularly friendly outreach. He keeps his elbow very close to his body and just offers a very, very sort of still handshake compared to our man walking across with the arm out like a Kiwi would. However, I researched this and I went back and had a look at Antony Blinken the week before, and it's the same thing. She doesn't offer much in these gatherings, these photos, so there was nothing to that. I think Hipkins looked like he did what he was being asked to do well, and within himself represented New Zealand in a kind of mature and gracious way. We don't know what went on behind Jo. You would have heard more of the thinking there. But I was also intrigued to read one of your jet mates in the business delegation, Fran O'Sullivan, in the Herald when she came back as well. And Fran's been on more of these kind of diplomatic business trips than any of the politicians, I imagine. Particularly to China. She's got a close interest there. And she rated him, and she gave him a pretty big pass mark on the pragmatism, on putting those business interests first, of still, saying what needed to be said at a level it needed to be said at. And so I thought that was impressive for him as well. That's not a given that a judge like Fran would necessarily give every leader, that kind of thumbs up. And I mean, your own view that, he hit that out of the park, I think, seems to have been mirrored elsewhere. Whether the rest of it with the other leaders, was it the case that you felt he did as well with the Premier and with the various Communist Party leaders?
Yeah, no, I think it was just a continuation through. I think the political side of things was a big success story for Chris Hipkins. I think there were other elements where it didn't come as naturally to him. And, if you put Jacinda Ardern in sort of a room full of lots of people where you have to make sort of a speech that kind of gets everyone excited and amped about trade and whatnot, and the relationship, she's an absolute firecracker when it comes to that sort of thing. Whereas, Chris Hipkins struggles a little bit with those sort of set-piece speeches. Also, all of the speeches that were written for him were the most boring speeches I've ever heard in my life. Even the business delegation said that they were on their phones because they got so bored listening to them. So whoever was writing them, which I understand was not people from the Beehive, it was people outside of the Beehive, do better next time. Jacinda Ardern obviously was a very good communicator, and so she'd do a lot of edits at the last minute, whereas Chris Hipkins, I think, probably didn't feel comfortable enough to be doing that, and possibly that's not his strength anyway. He's also not the world's best small talker, so there was like sort of situations where he would be with people where there was already a little bit of a language barrier, and they'd be sort of pointing to something or explaining something in sort of, broken English. And he would just kind of stare at it and not offer anything back. And it was kind of a bit awkward at times. But, that stuff I think you can get better at. And actually the business delegation said that, they found him pretty engaging and they found him pretty good for the most part when they were having sort of direct meetings with their Chinese counterparts in the business sense. So, yeah, I mean, a pretty successful trip. I think the tone was kind of set, which we didn't find out until, well, I certainly didn't find out until after the meeting with Xi. The tone had really been set the week before when Chris Hipkins had been asked about his perspective on Joe Biden, the US president's comments about President Xi being a dictator. Fascinating thing I found out on the trip was that Chris Hipkins' staff hadn't actually notified him that those comments had been made before he had his press conference where he had to respond to it. So Chris Hipkins very much going with his gut when he replied to that from New Zealand media before he headed overseas, and went with don't agree with Joe Biden, and just kind of, batted it away. And that was obviously really sort of appreciated and responded well to, and just set up like the tone, I guess, for that meeting in the Great Hall of the People. And just goes a little bit to show that Chris Hipkins, who we know uses his gut for just about everything, because he certainly doesn't have a sort of kitchen cabinet around him that he's asking advice from. When push comes to shove and you've got to use your gut, he got it really right in that situation. So, yeah, fascinating week for him. Now, of course, roaring straight over to Europe for this NATO meeting for next week. Another huge opportunity to talk to lots of world leaders on the side of that. Interested in your thoughts here, Mark. Do you think that that's going to be as much of a challenge for him, or do you think China was probably the really big test? Bearing in mind that I guess some of the people that he will be meeting at NATO, he's previously met in that earlier Europe trip that he did. Anything in particular you think we should be looking out for, I guess, on that trip?
I'm not sure about looking out for, but I think it would be an easier time for him. You know, there aren't the same sensitivities around NATO as there are around China. It's not hard to say Russia bad, Ukraine good, which is broadly the big issue there at the moment. And he's, you know, also going to be signing an FTA. It's sort of maybe more of a victory lap kind of thing than the China trip was. And so, you know, probably a bit more relaxed. Also, having gone through the China trip, you know, it means that he's got that experience built up, maybe a bit more confidence when he goes into the room with these other foreign leaders.
Tim, we're going to have Chris Hipkins doing a foreign policy speech before he heads off to NATO. This is the usual sort of annual layout, you know, what our foreign policy actually is. What do we need to expect from that? And, you know, is it really going to be any different from what Jacinda Ardern laid out or what John Key laid out? I mean, when it comes to foreign policy, we don't seem to move too far outside of the sort of box that we're in. So should we expect anything from that speech?
Oh, well, it'll emphasise our independent spirit again. And he needs to just deal with that attempt by some commentators in Australia and the US and elsewhere, the UK, to try and divide up our position over China and the US, and just needs to thread that. So perhaps, Joe, that speech might be a bit boring as well, because the writers will be having to do a very nuanced, careful, you know, approach to that. But he needs to do that again because, you know, there's a sort of almost a jealousy out of some of the commentary out of Australia in particular, that New Zealand has managed to keep both sides in a reasonable shape. And Australia, of course, didn't, and is trying now to get it in a different way with China, even though it's got, you know, AUKUS and the Quad and everything else that it's dealing with too. So, yeah, I think he needs to emphasise that independence, be heavy on the Pacific, on our re-engagement in a serious way with the Pacific, and that has implications beyond. And he should probably, as Mark says, you know, have a bit of a victory lap over the free trade deals with the UK before and now the EU. A little bit of gain there, and there's the potential for a big two-way trade gain with Europe. So there's a few good things there. It'd be interesting to see, you know, this week has settled down a bit domestically, hasn't it, for his ministers and for him. You know, at the start of the week it looked a bit mucky, but by now, you know, it's started to ease off and domestically, so he might just get away with getting out of the country again, hopefully leaving things in peace, school holidays, errant ministers away from the beehive, and to be able to go and do some of these things that, you know, are good for the country.
Thank you for successfully jinxing that for all of us, Tim. I will be ringing you and getting you to write about the next scandal.
Happy to step up.
Hey, I just want to jump in on that. It's interesting, the US thing, because and that relationship, because a lot of the speculation heading into the China trip and why there might be a little bit of frostiness was because of, you know, Ardern had obviously gone and had that White House visit last year, and there's been quite a few joint statements of late where New Zealand has been siding with the US and either putting out our own statements of the same position or joining those joint statements. And that has been sort of seen as some of the potential tension. So arguably, you could say that actually having a fresh Prime Minister and having Chris Hipkins go into that meeting with President Xi and not having that US baggage, other than having made a comment that China was actually deeply comfortable with in terms of disagreeing with Biden on the dictator thing, I think ultimately meant that Chris Hipkins was always going to have a better show at a better meeting than if you had sent Jacinda Ardern to China last week. Certainly my gut feeling about it anyway. Now for our audience question. Did Labour's Ingrid Leary accidentally walk into a mongrel mob meeting, or are there votes there to be courted? Tim, interested in your thoughts on this one?
Oh, well, this was something that really stood itself up to be one of the most implausible, unlikely, downright kind of farcical explanations, I think. The way that the PM told it, and I haven't heard it directly from the MP herself, but the way her leader told it was that she had thought she was going to an electoral commission organised gathering, and instead it was a mongrel mob gathering. Now, it may well be that the electoral commission had some connection to the mob. It's happened before up in Tairāwhiti where they've talked about enrolment. But for that explanation to be given when you've walked into a meeting of the mob talking about politics, and with their spokesperson subsequently not just talking about politics but endorsing, red vote Labour, red for red, I was thinking also that the Black Power ought to double con this and come out in favour of the blue side and see whether that works to stop National getting in. But it's just implausible. If you went into it by mistake, you'd leave. You'd make it clear it wasn't your thing. You don't want those votes. The Prime Minister has most of those votes, as it turns out, and our Māori Issues reporter, Aaron Smale's written about this. Most of the marginalised votes in those sort of groups are either not on the roll yet or on the Māori roll as well. So, it's a distinct thing here. National's playing it up, absolutely, as, another part of the coalition of chaos. The mob joins up, and it's difficult, but it's just almost too easy. And for Ingrid, really, what was she thinking?
It really is a bad day at the office for a Labour backbench MP when your actions lead to the Prime Minister being asked by every news outlet in the country whether you are courting the mongrel mob vote. I mean, that is just a spectacular fail on so many levels. Quite incredible.
Yeah, it's a bit strange how she hasn't been willing to sort of come out and explain exactly what happened there. The Electoral Commission did say that they had staff at that meeting, and it was one of those sort of, getting out the vote enrollment kind of things. So you can understand how there may have been room for misunderstanding, but come out and explain exactly how that happened. Don't just sort of, issue a brief statement and then make Chris Hipkins take the fall for it.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you think others might enjoy. Mark?
I really enjoyed Charlie Mitchell's piece in Stuff about the Nuremberg 2.0 movement, which is trying to basically put politicians and policymakers and officials and the media on trial for war crimes in relation to COVID. It was just a good sort of deep dive into a very strange part of the internet, but something that probably needed to be written.
What about you, Tim?
Look, I recommend a piece that we ran on Newsroom from our university partner, the University of Otago. They've got a series they're doing for us called Beyond the Soapbox on pre-election issues. And theirs is simply entitled, What If the Māori Health Authority Works? And it then makes the argument that it needs time. 1 year on is not the time to judge this. If politicians can come together, who knows?
And my recommendation this week is Simon Wilson's piece on the New Zealand Herald titled You're the Fucking Mayor. Sorry, Mum, for swearing because I know you're listening. It was a fascinating piece, if we call it that. It was basically a debate that took place, and these debates normally are sort of Chatham House rules and they never actually get into the media because there's quite a number of them. But this one, Simon Wilson from the Herald was invited along and has done a extraordinary write-up of not only the moot, which was where the media are drongos, but also just some of the commentary from the players in terms of that debate, from Auckland Mayor Wayne Brown to National MP Judith Collins, comedian Guy Williams, veteran journalist Sean Plunkett, Shane Jones. I mean, it had it all, and it was as colourful and outrageous as you can imagine. So have a read and cry a little bit inside. And
it only raised $13,000 for charity, so it was neither successful in that gain or in political judgments.
That's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, and our readers, listeners and watchers. Please send any burning questions you have to me, jo.moir@newsroom.co.nz. Thank you, Tim and Mark.
Thanks, Jo. I'm heading off to the Old Quarter next for a bit of food and see if I can spot any other mayoral scandals.
He's been working that into this, so well done.
Thanks.
You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.